Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome. My name is Keisha Nicole Knight, and I am the Director of Funds and Advocacy at the International Documentary Association. For our blind and low vision attendees, I'm going to do a visual description. I am a brown-skinned woman with black hair that's short. I'm sitting in front of a green background with a camera and some film reels that says IDA on it, wearing a purple jacket with light purple vertical dots. And so thrilled to have you all here today. This is our first of 3 panels in the Logan Elevate public programming series entitled Addressing the Western Gaze, Audience, Funding, and Success. So this series was developed as part of our Logan Elevate grant, which is generously supported by the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation. And it supports 3 female identifying or non-binary women of color from anywhere in the world who are working on their first or second features. And we're extremely thankful for the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation's continued support of IDA and of these filmmakers. So the program you'll experience in this series actually comes directly from the concerns of the current grantees. And they've developed these programs with the help of our IDA staff. So our grantees are Arya Rothe, who will be leading today's panel. And so today's panel, just to make sure you're in the right place, is Amplifying Small Stories. And Arya should be joining us now. Hi, Arya. And our second panel, which will happen on July 2nd, is called Storytelling Our Way, and that will be led by our grantee, Pallavi Somusetti. And our third panel in the series on July 9th is going to be called Working with Broadcasters, and that'll be led by Janai Bulos, our third grantee. So you can find all the information on this on the website and with the description so you know what you're getting. And finally, let me just give a round of thanks and then hand it over to Arya, because it takes so much organization to make this happen. And Maria Santos, who is currently at Sunnyside of the Dock, so couldn't join us today, but was really the motor behind getting this all together and helping our grantees, Arya, Janai, and Pallavi develop these programs. Katie Hurley and Armando Zamudio were also super helpful. Armando is producing the event today. And our access providers, I'd like to thank them. Zeke, who's providing our live captions, and Andrea Lust and Bob Laparo, our ASL interpreters. So now for the event. Let me introduce Arya, and then Arya, I'll leave it over to you. So Arya Rothe is an Indian filmmaker and co-founder of No Cut Film Collective, which was established in 2016 with filmmakers Christina Haynes from Romania and Isabella Rinaldi from Italy. This was established after the 3 studied together at Doc Nomads. Their directorial debut, A Rifle in a Bag, received a special mention in the Bright Future competition in the 2020 International Film Festival in Rotterdam and has been showcased at over 50 festivals and was featured on Mubi. The film also showcased at the Venice Biennale this year as part of the Doha Film Institute's collective exhibition. And they're currently in production on 2 feature-length projects, one of which is developing a sequel to A Rifle in a Bag. Arya has garnered support from numerous international organizations, and in addition to her work with No Cut, has worked in various roles, including director, writer, and editor on documentary projects for platforms like Arte, RTBF, Netflix, and Amazon Prime. Arya is based in Pune, India, and we are so thrilled to have her leading this conversation today, and so thrilled and honored to have her as one of our Logan Elevate grantees. So Arya, I'm going to leave it over to you, and excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Keisha, and thank you, the whole of IDA for this opportunity. First, sorry, I'm a brown-skinned woman with black eyes. I'm sitting in front of a white wall that has a painting on it, brown colored. I have black, long, curly hair, and I'm wearing a dark green colored blouse, which can also look black actually. So, Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to be part of this panel today and to have Koval and Shaunak join with me here. Maybe, guys, you can turn on your cameras. So, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this panel and coming here today. And thank you so much for all of you guys who have joined us online. I know most of you don't really need introduction to these two, but I want to say nice things about them. So let me quickly introduce them to you. So our first guest, Koval Bhatia, is a highly accomplished producer based out of Goa. Documentary producers in themselves are very rare to find in our country. And she has been my go-to person when it comes to understanding documentary landscape in within India and even outside of it. Her and Sarvanik's film Against the Tide, which by the way in the beginning was called Fish Finger Seductions, premiered and won the special jury prize at Sundance. She has received support from ITFA, Sundance Institute, San Francisco Film Fund, Catapult, Hot Docs, Doc Society, essentially almost all the funds you kind of dream of getting as a Indian filmmaker. She has also received IDA Getting Real Fellowship, and she has served as a chair of jury for IDEA Awards last year. Koval is currently directing her first feature documentary, and she's also co-founder of the platform Open Door Docs. It's a network building platform for Indian women in nonfiction. I'm actually a part of this group myself, and I think it's a really nice, safe, and collaborative space for women filmmakers in India where we can openly discuss our problems and share our work. So I'm really thankful, Koval, to you for that. And now moving on to our second guest, Shaunak Sen, who is one of the most accomplished filmmakers today. When I first heard about Shaunak and Aman's project, I think it was being pitched in 2019 and it was called Airborne. I remember watching the pitch trailer and getting really intrigued by Shaunak's worldview. It was like a deceptively ordinary topic, but the depth to which Shauna carried it with him, even in those 3.5 minutes, was very fascinating for me. And eventually, Airborne became all that breathes. The film premiered at Sundance and became the first Indian film to win the Grand Jury Award. Shaunak has a staggering list of achievements and awards, including Academy and BAFTA nominations in 2023, the Golden Eye Award for the Best Documentary at Cannes, three IDEA Awards, including the Best Feature, and the film very recently also won the Peabody Award. Shaunak also holds a PhD and has published in journals including Bioscope and Widescreen. And apart from being a scholar and a director, he's also producing documentary films. And actually, I'm witnessing one of the films he has been producing closely. And I always get the sense that he wants to advance documentary landscape, but not just for himself, but overall Indian filmmakers. And I think it's very open and helpful. Actually, I feel Koval and Shaunak, you both are super helpful and generous with your access. And I think it's special, especially because in India we are brought up in a very competitive environment. So I'm super excited to have these two here together. I'm still going to talk for 1 minute and then I'm going to hand it over to them, okay? So, what I wanted to also say is that they have both known each other for a long time and they have done their masters together from Jamia University in Delhi. And they have been close friends and part of each other's lives for 16 years. So, this panel is hopefully likely to turn into like a living room conversation between friends. And finally, this brings us to what our panel is about. In the last few years, Indian docs have reached new heights globally and are carving out unique place in world cinema. However, most of these projects, I think, are still funded by non-Indian organizations or producers based out of the West, particularly from US or Europe. And I'm hoping through this conversation with Koval and Shaunak, they can help us understand how do these funding structures impact the filmmaking process? How does one navigate the very crucial roles of being a director and a producer in this scenario? But to begin with, I first would like to talk a little bit about creative documentaries. While this term I feel is more familiar, maybe amongst independent documentary filmmakers or in Europe, it's not the most widely known term. So, guys, I wanted to ask you that how would you describe what a creative documentary means? And there are like two sub questions, and then I stop. Then it's all you, okay? And then why do you pursue it? And what kind of gaze you think it offers to the world of documentary cinema? Thank you.
Paul, do you want to go first?
Thank you for having us here today, Arya. I'll just quickly introduce myself visually. I am a brown-skinned Indian woman with longish curly hair that are usually out of control. I'm sitting on a gray couch, and there is a green wall behind me with very colorful circular baskets. Shaunak, would you like to describe yourself?
Yeah, I'm a brown-skinned Indian male with I'm wearing a brown kurta, and I'm sitting in a drawing room with white walls, and I wear glasses.
So, do you guys want to answer the question? Like, first, I'll just ask the first part of it, that how would you describe what a creative documentary is, and why do you pursue it? Both of you. Anyone can start.
Yes, I'll start. Um, I mean, I don't know really when you discussed this question with me previously, I was thinking about it. Like I find it a bit tricky to categorize films in that way because I think we often many of us struggle with defining like fiction, non-fiction, documentary, verite. There's all these tags, and I think creative documentary in my mind is something that sort of emerged as a way of describing some films that have come up recently, and I'm myself not entirely sure what it means. My hunch is, not to be presumptuous, is that these are the films that I think many of us are making where the process informs this idea of a creative documentary rather than the documentary itself. I think it's the way in which the filmmakers approach the subject, in which they are able to blur for themselves, the idea of what verite, what narrative, what structure can possibly mean. And I think it also is a way to say to yourself that, look, I'm making this film, I have this incredible story, and it's almost like giving yourself permission to approach that story with all the very many storytelling tools that you have, rather than subscribing to a set, sort of preset notion of what documentary cinema with a capital D looks like. So, I mean, that's honestly it. But like I said, I approach this question with caution because I don't believe in the validity of this label.
I have to say, for me, it's not about process. It is about the cinematic object. And for me, what's usually more interesting is um, thinking of the label as a kind of an anti-goalpost instead of a goalpost. So when you think of what the creative documentary is not, so when I began making films, I was more sure of what I did not want to do. For instance, there was a certain toolkit of filmmaking, like talking heads and a certain, it's a kind of lexicon of filmmaking that I'm certain most people here would be very familiar with, that I wanted to kind of militate against. And in doing so, it became clear to me that firstly, I was personally interested in, using the toys of fiction to tell a non-fiction story. So for me personally, um, I'm interested in documentary that doesn't just stay restricted to journalism, but is as interested in cinema. And not that journalistic documentaries are like I really enjoy and value a lot of them, but I was interested in a certain legacy or cultural sort of historical trajectory of filmmaking that felt to me fairly distinct from what one known as a what one knew as a traditional documentary. So for me, in India, to give you examples, this was films like, say, John and Jane by Oshim Ahluwalia, or films by Sukhdev in the 60s, etc. Or in terms of contemporary global cinema, it's the films of, say, Victor Kosakowski or Gianfranco Rossi, or so it felt like this was a particular um, sort of a trajectory of filmmaking that was interested in what can vaguely be called a kind of creative treatment of actuality, or a kind of, where you're interested vaguely in some kind of an interfacing with the world as it occurs. However, you're interested in questions of beauty, of aesthetics, of, a kind of storytelling, which makes it as much an aesthetic project as it is about questions of ethics, or questions of, social justice and so on. So, and unfortunately, we've all sort of tried to rail against this Manichaean tradition of thinking of nonfiction as that which has to carry the burden of, social justice and serious issues or themes, whereas the other stuff about character or storytelling or aesthetics is sort of like always been the provenance of fiction. And obviously, like all of us, like a lot of us felt deeply troubled by that kind of a binary. And why should, we carry the burden of the social, while um, the other delicious stuff of character and story gets relegated entirely to the domain of fiction. So for me, it was trying to kind of like it's the tradition of nonfiction filmmaking that doesn't adhere to those kinds of norms of just being about a certain kind of it could also be about that, but is as attendant to questions of aesthetics and form and character.
Nice. I think I agree with some of the things that you both said. Like, I do feel that creative documentary also look deeply upon the processes of how you make the film, which is something that you also, I think, spoke about, Shaunak. But I agree with you that it does bring in, eh, correct me if I'm understanding this right, that for you, it does bring in, it's an introduction of a new gaze of looking at documentaries. Could it be the right way of saying it?
I mean, it might be a bit more grandiose than I intend for it to be. I just mean that for me, uh, this there is no blueprint or a broader kind of a pedantic slogan of what creative documentary can be per se. There's no one taxonomic definition, right? Uh, I think for me, creative documentary meant that I would be like, I can actually break it down to the nuts and bolts of the most technical, almost petty sounding things, wherein I was interested in using cranes and dollies and tracks and the usual sort of armature of things that are not considered part of the doc world, So it started by building that, or for like a kind of a narrative spine that almost makes people feel like, is it fiction, or like it feels almost like the outer container or the shell of it is fiction. And also for me, it was as much a question of aesthetics and beauty, and I'm interested in, like, the beautiful in cinema, and to not kind of dismiss that for or in service of truth, or thinking of those as mutually exclusive buckets, right? So I think
Hmm.
that's sort of my entry point into it.
Koval, do you have something more to add to this?
No, I think we
Like, in the sense of how was your process, like the
yeah.
creative documentary cinema that you said is close to the kind of process that you follow in filmmaking. How do you think those two correlate for you?
To be honest, I think we get asked this question a lot, is at nearly every festival, and I'm sure Shaunak's heard that too. Wait, is this film scripted? Is this fiction? Is this non-fiction? There's always some variation on that theme. And I think for me, that is usually like um it tells me something about the way in which creative documentary has both evolved and how it is received, and kind of opening up an imagination of what we're doing with the form. I wouldn't say that it's a new gaze of looking at it, but it certainly borrows from an entire plethora of what exists out there, and sort of, I mean, I think what Indian creative documentary, since this panel is about, that is also taking from traditions learning from what some of the language and the grammar that we've seen before, how we don't want to use it. We have sort of lived under this burden of carrying the social and at the altar of the aesthetic for a very long time. And I think there's been this resurgence where it says you can have both, but it's not a burden. We want to tell this story and we want to tell it a certain way and it looks a certain way. And then, there is everything else. So it is also rooted, I think, in our traditions of documentary cinema and then the ones that exist here in India.
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree with you that actually the creative documentary landscape in India does come from our cinema from the 60s and the 70s. Like Shaunak was also speaking of Sukhdev and documentary filmmakers back then, or filmmakers back then. Okay,
In
cool. So
fact,
I'll move
let's
on.
add on
Yeah,
one thing,
tell me.
Arya,
Yeah,
which is
go
that,
for it.
it's almost like, in the interest of you said, let's make it a drawing room chatter sort of a thing. So
Yeah.
the thing is to add on I do feel like the kind of creative kinship that in terms of like who are the people who you feel like you are contemporary to in terms of form and so on, is, you rightly said, it could be, say, in India, for instance, 60s, the filmmakers that we just mentioned, or some films in the early 2000s. But even though I admire a lot of the Indian docs that have happened since, I don't feel a kind of a creative kinship with them in terms of form, especially within the ages of what I think we're trying to vaguely describe as creative documentary. And in that, I feel like, for instance, in All That Breathes, I felt closer to, say, Apichit Pong or certain films by Tarkovsky as a kind of, even though it's fiction, but as a kind of an approach to it, which is to say that, it's like fiction often tends towards non-fictive tendencies, and sometimes non-fiction tends towards fiction tendencies, and you sort of find your creative kin somewhere in the middle. So there's a large swath of Indian nonfiction that I enjoy and admire. But this film is not part of that legacy. But there's an earlier sort of tradition that I do feel that this film is a part of. So, and I would place that earlier tradition as a kind of the trajectory of creative documentary.
Earlier in India, but globally, I think it's a much wider, like you were saying, like Soviet films. I also feel this when I watch both your films, that especially your Shaunak, that it does have an influence of Soviet filmmakers from 70s, 80s, like Tarkovsky, or even Apichat Pong also, you said, which is very interesting. I
Yeah.
didn't think of it, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, which is to say that maybe geography is not as interesting a kind of determinant, right? It's like
I agree.
because you're talking about slow cinema as a language, as a grammar, and that's geography is not the best kind of lens through which to look at those kinds of affinities.
I I agree with you on this, that I think it's much more than that and it's much more global than that. I agree. Okay. So I will move on to our next question. So let's get into the funding landscape altogether. That when you're making a film like this, and like you both said, that you're proposing a language that is getting molded. I mean, for sure, it is inspired by a lot of global resonances that you both have felt, but it is also getting molded. And we are trying to make these documentaries, but funding becomes a major part of it. And in order to talk about funding, I have to say that there is a major lack of infrastructure for funding documentaries within our country. So we have like Docage, or we have Doc Film Bazaar that opened up this year, which are your pitching platforms where you can go for co-productions, or to, again, the aim is to find a global support for your films or your documentaries. Or like Khushbu Ranka initiated India Docs with you, actually, Shaunak and Archana. But in the process of this, we have realized one thing, that it's not easy to set up a funding system here. And we barely have any state funds, financing avenues. And as a result of it, all of us apply to very few global funds, which are predominantly from the US or Europe, or few from South Korea or Doha, etc. So all over the world, people are applying to these funds. Competition is very high. Chances are getting selected are quite low. So what I wanted to ask you guys is that, and I feel basically this financing structure affects the choices that we make during the filmmaking process right from the ideation. So what I'm curious about it is that when you're exploring something like creative documentaries, how was your process of applying to film funds? How did you think about it? Not just like the applications themselves, but how did you strategically went about it, like for both of you, for your films? Okay, cool, we'll go first. I will just say it now.
Let's throw one at Shaunak next. Okay, cool. I mean, well, shit, like it's bad out there. We all know it. We've discussed it. Every single documentary filmmaker from India spends a majority of their life explaining to their friends, family, and the rest of the world how god awful it is and how it's just getting worse. So I don't really know what to say on that because it isn't. It's not getting better. It's definitely getting worse. It's getting worse politically, financially, in terms of us being able to explore themes and so on and so forth. And I don't have a very optimistic outlook on this front, but I think what I do have a certain amount of optimism about is that there's also a stronger ecosystem. We are we are more of us sort of out there, and I know, like you said, there are a lot more of us trying to pay it forward and kind of pass on the knowledge, the access that we can, because that's something that I've realized is critical. I think in all the when I was writing for funds applying, I think it was just a very bumpy journey. Like the first year was quite bumpy. Like most of the time you're just sort of grappling around. It was also my first time doing something like this. I'd never produced before. I'd never worked on a feature. It was a completely different space. I have never worked on a documentary. I came from advertising. So it was almost like this whole new world. And of course, you're just kind of crashing about, you're Googling day and night. And I think at that time, it became apparent that there is this information out there. There is a world out there, and one must know everything about it somehow to actually be able to navigate it. And I think that's where a lot of the roadblocks lie. And I think some of that has been removed just because now there are enough of us here from here who have those tools, those access points. So that one thing gives me hope. But in terms of the actual ecosystem, I mean, Shaunak might have had a different or have a different view, but I'm quite constantly wondering why do this. And to be very honest, there are times I ask myself, why do this? And then you think, okay, no, I really, really want to do it. And so you keep going. And I don't, and in terms of how it affects the kind of films you're making, I think in many ways, we were innocent to some of this, and therefore we didn't let it affect us. I cannot say with good faith whether it'll be the same in my other projects or my future projects, but I think because it was the first time, there was a certain innocence, and I think that innocence of sometimes backfired, but it also allowed us to make the film a certain way, unhindered, unabashed, untouched by some of these factors. But now having experienced it, I'm not sure that I have, I mean, I have that kind of naivety, which allows me to say, you know what, this is the film and this is how it will stay. And it'll be completely unchanged by the structures of funding and finance. But I think I'll find out over the next few years.
I think for me, yes, right. So the thing is that I'd already made a film before which had completely knackered me socially, emotionally, financially, in every way. And you feel like you're totally sort of spent. And by this film, I was absolutely certain that me and my producing partner, Aman, we initially wanted to be professional grant writers and not filmmakers, because we realized that unfortunately the structure is gamed out in a way where initially you're not a filmmaker. You have to do the cynical thing of figuring out grants. Now the thing is that the grant structure for me, like I have, and I think Koval had a similar experience, that the grants are wonderful support systems in terms of not just providing the initial impetus financially, but also sort of in the, in the cavernous darkness of the early film journey, to just be there and say that we're here for any kind of help and so on. So initially, and this was a purely tactical sort of a strategic decision, which is that we were initially making a 3-minute pitch trailer, and we were making a 10 to 15-minute demo reel. And the mistake I had made with my earlier film, Cities of Sleep, is that I sort of, went the whole haul initially. I started shooting the film first and then tried to cull out from it the best kind of sample reel material. And that, I think, was a complete, and I just, that wasn't for me, because what happens is then it's very stopgap, right? You run out of money, then you wait, you apply, you wait for a few months for a grant to come in, and then you again continue. And that sort of elliptical stopgap form was just not for me. So I didn't want to initially take the full sort of leap. So what I did was that with the characters, I clearly explained to them what the current structure is. That, you arrive at a 3-minute, that's the first milestone. You sort of arrive at a 10-minute, that's 10 to 15-minute, that's the second milestone. And after that, once there's a kind of concatenation of grants, once more grants come in, is when you have a bigger kitty to have a more continuous production schedule. So initially, we just sort of shot in very small spurts, literally on weekends, to kind of arrive at an adequate 3-minute. Now, for filmmakers out there, especially in India, who often ask me what are the things to sort of consider when you put in a grant application. Personally, for me, there are 3 things that I think work, and I was sort of doggedly kind of chasing after them. One is that obviously most grants expect a kind of a kind of a sense of the world building. They want to get a sense of the character, and of course, this is all very rudimentary and super generalized. But thirdly, and this is where I think a lot of sort of grant submissions fall short, is a sense of conflict. And this is something we keep hearing in different, like I'm sure Koval has heard this word, and as have you, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, which is, the number of people who just keep saying conflict, where's the challenge, so to sort of like figure out how you can speak in that language initially. Now, once the money sort of initially comes in, and after that, you can go through the foreign co-pro model, or you can go through the private equity model. Then there are obviously different kinds of routes. But once the money comes in, then you sort of like seize the autonomy to make whatever film you want to make, but initially, it's almost like factoring in the film through a kind of grid of intelligibility that is more structural rather than personal. And thereafter, sort of like, and once you've gotten the resources that you need, then you make the film that you want to, and thereafter you make the film in the style, in the form, and all of that, and about the about the social that you're deeply invested in thereafter. But the initial process is this kind of a weird halfway house of, the first 6 months. It's the where you're just arriving at development reel. And I think it's good to sort of know that you're in development right now, and therefore pace yourself, because it is a marathon. So therefore pace yourself accordingly, so that you have the emotional cardio to kind of really get into full launching when you're in the production reel cycle.
I think I would
Koval, is
also,
this the, yeah.
yeah, I think I'd also speak, because I've been working with a lot of, especially because we've been running this platform, is that we're also reconciling that not all films get the kind of funds and support and so on and so forth, or it happens at a later stage. And I found it very kind of important for it. Like there was that whole IDA survey on how do documentary filmmakers sustain themselves. And somebody said dad's money, somebody said run a bar, somebody said I teach. And those are the realities across. But I think in India, especially, we don't have the funds for development. So I think I've started kind of, especially when I'm consulting or I'm working with first-time filmmakers, especially, is that it's the raw truth that the first year when you're developing is more or less self-funded, because there is no way around that unless you are able to pull in resources from within your life or have an ecosystem that allows it. And so it becomes super important to use that year in learning everything you can. I think one of the things that I realized, and I think it was uh, being this unencumbered producer on my first project, which also allowed me, is to study. I went at it with a vengeance, like learning everything there was about co-productions, private equity, what are the funds, what are they funding, what are the amounts, which countries have what co-production. And I urge anybody who wants to be a producer or work with a producer to kind of do that, because it may seem like it's just this thing that exists and you'll figure it out, but it's actually not. You'll save yourself a lot of heartache if, while you're developing the materials and your potential pitch in the first year, there is somebody, if hopefully not you, in your team also figuring out the funding and the financing ecosystem, because it will be eventually down to this team of one or two people, usually the way Indian films are made, to kind of navigate it for a while to come. And I think the other thing about pitch and kind of structuring your materials, I agree. I think I review for funds, and I consciously took up this profile, so to speak, like to start reading and reviewing funds and across geographies. But it's also taught me something, I think, and that's why I keep bringing up this educate yourself or access, is because I've realized that, especially like the first thing I usually do is I pull up applications from South Asia. And what occurred to me very quickly is that a lot of the time, it's not that the story is not there. It's not like the language is not there. It is there. I think it's more or less about not having access to the kind of, like fundamentals. Like I literally saw fundamental things missing, where somebody in, for example, I remember the other day, somebody in project overview had written about the production stage. So I feel like catering to like a large, wide gamut of people who are attending this today is just to kind of look at the documentary core application, talk to people who've done this sort of thing before, and thoroughly understand why these applications are the way they are. And eventually they become a way of telling your story, like through and through. And if you get too caught up in the logistics of it and the numbers and the specifics of it, and it doesn't come across that what you have is this very well thought out film with a team that's going to make this film happen, irrespective of whether this grant comes on board or not, it's difficult to kind of say, yes, I think this application should. I'm giving you a very pure kind of view of what I approach applications with. So yeah, I mean, I think it's about literally going online and studying and going to forums, attending markets.
So one thing
Can I
that
just
I feel, yeah, go for it, Sean. And
Well, I
then
just
I
want to add
will.
a quick thing because I don't want people to be like, if there are younger filmmakers, to be intimidated by the. Remember that this is actually a very finite set of things. Ultimately, there are like, literally a hand-picked set of 6 funds that are, and it takes literally a day to know what the co-pros.
Yeah.
It's not actually that complicated, but it requires you to put your head in. And the thing that all of us have benefited from is that actually the documentary community is very helpful. It's like when we were all making our films, say Vinay and Khushbu were making, Vinay was making While We Watched. Before that, Vinay and Khushbu were making An Insignificant Man, and so on. And there's always this kind of a cross-pollination in terms of information with filmmakers. So if you just specifically ask questions to filmmakers who've done, usually it's not very difficult to figure out. Both co-pros and grants are fairly are not that many for it to be prohibitively difficult. And just one thing, even if one does an addendum to what Koval was saying, now there are grants like the Catapult research grant, which is actually giving you money even if you're not at the stage of a reel. So there are now like these wonderful grants like granting agencies like Catapult who are actually who are saying that it's not mandatory to send in audiovisual material.
So, okay, I'm going to get in. I think, like, firstly, it's super helpful what you guys are sharing, because I think a lot of people who are attending today definitely want to know about the funding structure. But I kind of also want to go in another direction, which is basically that we are all right now while talking are kind of saying that there are certain things that we have to do in order to follow this financial structure to make our films visible. And Shaunak, you said something very interesting, which was that once you get the money, then you can make the film. So what I mean, then you can make the film that you have wanted. So there are two parts to my question for both of you, is that what do you think are the choices that you made while applying to the funds that could have made it, let's say, amenable to these funding bodies while applying? And the second part of it is that because you guys have secured funding from almost like all of the major funds for your both of your films, how does one, and maybe this is not so much related to funding, but it is sometimes related to co-production, that when if you are pitching and if there is a co-production market and if you have a co-producer on board, at times more international the film becomes, for sure it gets richer, for sure it starts reshaping itself, but there is also the fear of losing this gaze that you were saying, that we are following all of these structures in order to get some accessibility, in order to achieve some global visibility. But then how does one maintain this insider's gaze that we have always had as filmmakers from our countries? So these are like two questions that I thought were emerging from the conversation, what both of you guys were saying about how to go about applying to funds, basically. So any one of you can start.
Fine, Shaunak. Okay. I think I answered your first one more or less because, like I said, for me, it was especially a case of we were innocent of some of these conversations and also the process. So it was sort of like hit and miss, hit and miss, hit and miss, learn, fail, fail, fail. So there was a lot of that in the mix. Of course, there was a point where we suddenly realized, oh, okay, so while our film is inherently about climate change, did we always think to put that front and center? What does that mean? So you end up having some of these conversations and you try and put a lot of it in the topic summary because you don't want it spilling into your story and other bits which are yummier. But you do realize that, okay, so also, I mean, there are specialized funds, right? There are funds like Doc Society that primarily looks at climate. There are funds like Redford, which look at climate films. So you start to kind of engage more, okay, saying at some point, you have to kind of keep in mind, okay, I don't think this is a climate film because it's very important to, I think, especially for the director to remember that this is the film that they're making. But at some point you will start hearing people and it becomes this little echo chamber where you're always hearing these definitions people are imposing on you. And it does start to impact how you talk about the film. And I don't think it affected the way we were thinking about or making the film, but it certainly seeped into the way we were presenting the film, which I think is more, I mean, it's strategic. It's a tactic. And I think it works just fine. I think everybody does it. It's almost kind of, it's ingrained in the system itself. That is the game. In terms of co-production, I generally, again, this is just one of those things that I personally have experienced on multiple projects that I'm producing, is that it helps to have a strong base of the film where you have either secured funding or you bring something into the co-production where you can bargain and negotiate terms. There is something to be said because like we know that not every film gets those 6 funds and you suddenly don't have like, oh, I raised 40% of the funding, so now I can bargain at the table. Something to be said for sweat equity, the access you bring and so on and so forth. But strategically speaking, I think it's always better to get into co-production once you have kind of strengthened the film in terms of both the filmmaking, what you're doing with it, where it's undeniable, where it's yours, and also in terms of visibility, that you have been to certain markets, you have shared it with people, you have a certain amount of assurance. And it also really depends. I think we've been lucky to have people working with us where they understood that what we were bringing to the table was strong and that it was best left alone, that there was no editorial input from them required, because they don't know what we're talking about most of the time. But I don't think that happens all the time. And I think there's a lot of bargaining and negotiation, and you have to be very clear, like where you draw the line. And I think these are conversations that you bake into the contract about editorial control and creative say, and because there's no point doing it afterwards and feeling bad. But yeah, but I think we did want to call the shots, and we did, and I think it was a good position and not one that happens all the time. So you try and get as close to that as humanly possible.
Yes.
I'd love to have a look at your contracts, Koval, if you had baked in safeguards for sovereignty. That's sort of elusive beast for me. But the way that I think I approach it is that the question of sovereignty is very interesting in terms of how much does a Western, it could be, any kind of money. It could be Eastern money, it could be Japanese money, it could be whatever. So I think to any sort of perspective that is not embedded or grounded within your vernacular or colloquial context is what we're talking about. But for me, it's almost like so in terms of the stages of the film, the development stage is often where the social contract is of unmitigated deception almost, right? Like it's all when you're pitching a film and doing the 3-minute pitch, everybody in the audience knows that this is only a slight glimpse of the film. Nobody knows what the language will evolve into. You know that the game is of lying through your teeth almost, but not in a malicious way, right? It's almost like give us a sense, a kind of speculative leap on what it could be. And somewhere in that kind of airy, ungrounded sort of speculation, some kind of partnership will come in. So initially, I'm not at all tethered to. I know that the 3-minute that I'm making might have no connection to the final film at all. And very often I've seen projects which look entirely different, actually. And that's how it's meant to be. It's not like you're actually cheating anybody. Everybody knows that that's how it goes. Now, the thing about foreign collaborators is that for me, it feels very uh, delightful to me to have the chance of creatively collaborating with department heads that I'm excited about. So, for instance, working with Ben, the German cinematographer who shot on my film, whose work I've always sort of been awestruck by. And I'd seen his films and sort of wrote a cold love letter saying, would you consider working in this film and so on. Or for instance, Charlotte, the Danish editor who had cut films like Act of Killing or The Truffle Hunters and so on. And I sort of reached, so that's one end of what you might call a kind of, they are foreigners to the story in terms of not being culturally grounded, but they bring to bear a kind of skill set that is often adding to, because the main bulwark of the approach is me and the directorial team, who are all basically very grounded in Delhi, very embedded in the colloquial context of Delhi. So there's that level of kind of additions which are like always generative and productive. Now, I think what you're obviously mentioning is a producer who comes in,
Yes,
or
I'm
some
speaking morely of co-productions. I do understand the richness that, because I also do it myself. So I do understand the richness of multiple perspectives coming together. And like you said in the beginning, that we do live in a more global world where resonances are more global than, let's say, just Indian or just from the past.
Yeah,
But it's the
yeah.
second thing.
I mean, and just to add on to that earlier point, the thing is that very often I might feel more resonant with a German cinematographer than I might feel with certain Indian cinematographers, right? Because these are not, like
100%.
you were saying, geographically restricted
No,
at all.
no,
In
no.
terms of
It's a
producerial,
transcultural medium. So,
because
I mean, it's a transcultural medium. So.
yeah, because it's like we're dealing with the country of cinema in this case, to put it grandiosely. But the thing is that in terms of producerial things, of course, um, it's not easy depending on the model that you're in. Unlike Koval, my model of production was not foreign co-production; it was private equity. So it wasn't like I was getting different chunks and cobbling together a patchwork quilt of funds from different countries. That was not what I was doing. I sort of got it from one in one fell swoop, like one tranche from one studio, right? So it's a different kind of a model altogether. And in that, the question often is like constant iteration. And for me, the thing is that I think one very key word that Koval said, which is sweat equity, which is something that I feel like often, like I also didn't know of adequately earlier, which is to actually value the amount of time and this thing that you've given. And it's almost like the assumption here of, or I would often make the assumption that I've worked on it for 10 months. The first 3 months I was just sort of researching, but that's also valued time. So to sort of be able to find a slab that is a more globalized slab of value, because you're also bringing something of value in it, right? So um, to hold on to that. And also, of course, grants give you a kind of additional safety valve or a kind of muscle that it's already, if you come in with some grants, it kind of levels the playing field. But finally, it's my main position here is that there is no pristine world of pure unadulterated sovereignty. It's like there is no world in which my edit room is not going to get cluttered. I wish there was, but I haven't encountered it. And that is the hardship of being a professional filmmaker. And the thing is, I don't work with the assumption of finding that I wish there was, but I haven't found it. And that kind of, constant grappling and arm wrestling is part of the process. Sometimes it can work to your advantage. Sometimes it can be it can be really tough. And I don't know if that is limited to just a Western co-producer. It could be true of anybody with a different sensibility, even from Bombay, right? So those are kind of like things that are always happen. And like Koval said, I think those three kinds of clauses of exactly what the final cut flowchart is, exactly what the exit or divorce clause is, those kinds of conflict scenario clauses, those are things that one has to really sort of put one's head in.
Nice. So, okay, so based on all of this, I think I have a final question before we can go to Q&A, because I mean, I resonate with almost everything you guys have said, because I completely understand that we do not function in a completely perfect world, and we don't even know what it is to have this very insider's gaze that but I mean, anyway, so moving on, I will quickly ask my question because I can see I only have 5 minutes. So based on this, I'm curious that how you guys as filmmakers define being in position of power then. See, because of all like the success that you both have achieved, there is a perception that you both have some, okay? Like when I speak with new filmmakers or even myself, I would imagine that, okay, you guys are in some position of power to call the shots about the films the way you want to make them. How do you guys actually feel that you are in position of power when it comes to making your next films? And if so, how? And if not, why?
Shaunak,
You
this
can
one
also
is
define position of power for yourselves, what it means to you also.
Right, right. Um, well, for me, I got a bit bamboozled by the last part of your question. Do you mean power in terms of making my own film, or do you mean power in terms of the positions one occupies of gatekeeping for vis-a-vis other filmmaker? I thought that's initially how you meant it.
I think those are correlated, no? Because if you have those powers, then your way of making your film or your access to your next film, whether you're producing or directing, it changes, no? So I think those two things that you're saying
I
are
mean, for
correlated for
me, at
me.
the moment, it hasn't. It might, but at the moment, I can give you like irreducible specifics of how it is. Now, I mean, there's no denying that what, what doing a film that, does well in the world immediately sort of catapults you into positions where you're able to make certain projects legible or visible to a certain grid of intelligibility to which resources are connected. That is undeniable. For instance, like Koval is in part of grant juries, I've been in part of various festival juries and so on. Firstly, that's obviously a very transient thing. That's a kind of spotlight that, goes off like this. So it's not like, it's definitely not a stultified or ossified kind of position of power over time. It's usually a year, literally, wherein you're occupying these things. But more than that, I think power in the sense of knowledge, which is undeniable. And that's the kind of like obvious, critical introspection that one has to do, which is that obviously one has acquired knowledge by the way of where one is. And in my way, the sort of like highly imperfect hygiene toolkit for me is to try and so I am not doing a non-fiction film right now. I'm, uh, I'm quite burnt from the real world, and I want to sort of like, I wanted to not do docs for the time being. But what I am doing is I'm producing, therefore, and there are 4 films that Aman and I are producing at the moment, all of which are obviously like trying to pass on the kinds of like offers or something that have come to projects that we think are interesting, or people that whatever, or projects that have come to us that are interesting and that we've. And of course, it's like it's a constantly shape shifting kind of contour of things. Every now and then, like every second day, as I'm sure Koval is, many people come to me with projects. And the truth is that I'm now quite, for at least the next few months, quite brimful, and I don't know what. But if it's about information dispensation, I usually try and like send a voice note or something to kind of help. But in terms of my own practice, that I think whittles down to questions of relationships with the subject, which is a whole, like a universe into itself. I don't know if we should get into
Literally.
it now. Yeah. And, it's like also in terms of how one comports oneself with one's crew during the edit and the long tail of the film. So for me, the ethical sort of hygiene tool is, how one deals with one's characters, how they are connected or tethered to the journey of the film. Questions of money, whether one pays one's characters or not, those are very important, I think. Also, when a film suddenly starts like, skyrocketing and doing really well, how connected are the characters to that spotlight? Like, are they coming to big fest? A whole range. Sorry, I'm doing a really bad job of really like crystallizing a lot of things. But in terms of personal film practice, that's what I think it comes down to. But in terms of people in the documentary circuit, yeah, I think it's for a year, sort of one has the responsibility of being evaluators of taste, because one is invited in certain things. And it's not like I'm, one person is sitting and adjudicating everything. It's a process and so on. But that also sort of changes. So I just like one has to also, while one has to definitely own up to, the sudden showering of this kind of a privilege and sudden doors that have flung open, but also keep in mind the undeniable transience or fleetingness of it. Koval?
Absolutely transient. Yeah, I mean, on one hand, you're here, everybody's like, oh my God, Sundance, oh my God, all of that. And the other hand, you're like, uh, I'm asking Shaunak, hey, do you know how to get a slightly experimental art house film done? Because I don't think I know that pathway at all, and I don't think anybody wants to talk to me about it,
Yeah.
ever. So
Yeah.
really, like it's of course, I mean, there are so many advantages to having had one film that kind of breaks through, as people like to define it. And it is very much about knowledge. It is very much about sort of access to networks and spaces, which are also transient because people move on, people change. I mean, I've more or less, the documentary industries, is in a huge flux. So everybody's just moved on or exited. So a lot of these so-called connections really in today's landscape they're not very solid, really.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
funny, the number of, like I was working on another film for another filmmaker, and I wrote to a bunch of people from human rights that I'd met at Leipzig, and bounce, 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 bounce. And I was like, oh, well, okay. So it is super transient. It is super in flux. Knowledge is something like, I think it also teaches you a lot of resilience. And there is something to be said for resilience, and you just kind of develop this slight, like, you start with an air of invincibility when you first start your film, and then the world breaks it down and reduces you to parts. And now there's a different kind of invincibility, which is that, we'll see, it's going to get made. you'll figure it out one way or another, and it's like a full circle of that cloak of invincibility. And in terms of the power, honestly, I guarantee you could go to 10 different heads of content and network in India right now and ask them how many of them know of either of us or our films. And you'd be, well, actually, Shaunak, you're on HBO, so maybe. But it's really, it's amazing how
Can
little it matters. I
sorry,
mean,
sorry.
yeah.
No, go on, go on.
No, so it's really it's all great, and I think you basically take all the amazing things that happen and try and kind of bundle them up and see, okay, how do you use it? But for the most, I think most of us are trying to use it to, of course, see what we want to do next. Like I'm now directing, so it's informed me, but it almost feels like I'm starting from scratch because it's a different process. I'm also working on a very different genre altogether. But then I try and use all of that into my producing projects. And also I do a lot of, as you know, Arya, a lot of phone calls with people and do open hours through the month. And so then you're just like, okay, I have this wealth somehow and I have it for a little while and just quickly dissipate it and invest it in your peers.
Can I just add
Wow.
one thing before we open up to the Q&A? It sounds in this conversation like there is no funding in India at all, which is now changing, and things are very much in flux. And two of the projects that we're working on right now have actually come in from production houses in Bombay who have offered who are cute. So like people are very curious about nonfiction suddenly, even in India. So it is not the case that it's one unchanging homeostatic thing that there's no money in India at all. A lot of production houses in Bombay, I mean, a lot of them actually are producing their own nonfiction, and not just true crime or reality TV, but actually creative nonfiction.
That's really good news if that's happening. Because I think like the assumption for all of us is that private equity is very difficult to access. But anyway, I'm going to move to Q&A because there are a lot of questions from a lot of people, but oof, so many things. Thank you guys. I have a lot of reflections in my mind, but I will message them to you probably. But now, for now, I'll quickly go to Q&A. So we have a question from Tarini. Based on both filmmakers' claim on beauty in the film, do you believe that documentary filmmakers in the past were intentionally trying to produce films that were not beautiful or aesthetically pleasing? And there are two parts to it. And how does a preoccupation with beauty infect the sense of truth or reality that a film could reveal? And why is the social considered a burden? Where does the idea come from? And is it playing into deeper Malay, I don't
Malaise.
know how to pronounce malice around concerns of a social nature?
Should I quickly, because I think I spoke some of those points. Well, firstly, the thing is that it's not, the point is to not make the margin the new center, or I don't at all say that one should compromise the social in favor of aesthetic questions. I don't at all mean to side with a kind of empty formalism. I meant to uh, place as much importance in the questions of form and aesthetics, but as much be chasers of, of the social, or chasers of truth, as it were. Um, I neither did I say that films in the past were not. I wasn't making a universal blanket statement like that. I was trying to trace a specific genealogy of films that I personally find more kinship with, in which from the 60s, for instance, I mentioned Sukhdev, or I mentioned Osham Ahluwalia, or or Gitanjali Rao, or like lots of filmmakers who I think form a narrow sliver that aren't necessarily always a kind of a cozy part of a broader verite observational filmmaking. So that's what I really meant in terms of how it. What was the third part, Arya?
What is the social, why is the
Oh,
social
why is the
considered
social
a
a burden?
burden?
Oh, I just about that. What I think Koval also spoke about it, so Koval can clarify. But for my part, what I meant was that it often is the case that films from India in the last 10 years, or in the last, like even before that, it would be the case that our films had to do with sociological questions of, of class, or of poverty, or some such, and which are all obviously very important things, and I hope we all continue to make stories about them. But it felt like we were all making, like, a lot of the documentaries here were produced largely through a social optic, whereas a lot of the other films, like say of our European counterparts, I would say that they were, a film like All These Sleepless Nights, for instance. I've never, like, why a film like that hasn't come out of India. That's just an example I'm giving. So it felt like the social was more entrenched here, which is not to in any way denigrate the social, obviously, or even to in any way take a knock on filmmakers who've done excellent work on it. I just meant to expand the purview of it, not to critique the purview that was.
Cool.
Same, same.
Okay, I will
And
go to the Sorry, yeah. Paul, do you want to say something?
no, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything. And of course, that is why we're having these conversations, because there are a lot of people doing a lot of very many different things in the space of documentary. And I think
One
it's,
doesn't, I think one doesn't take away the thing from the other. Like, I think what you
oh,
guys were
absolutely
talking
not. These are
about
not,
was your preferred
yeah,
way of making films.
yeah.
So, moving on to the next question. How do you develop your documentary films to reach? Sorry, this is from Wolfgang. How do you develop your documentary films to reach a global audience? Which topics depend on the subject matter, and what are the topics where the global reach is assured?
Cool.
Okay.
I feel, sorry, Koval kind of answered this already with her process of funding, but if you have something more to add to this.
Oh, I will let Shaunak start.
Um, my only, like, the first thing is that I don't think to think that something that assures global this thing is not the right way to do it. Because as the cliche goes, the market and the industry does not know what it wants, and it keeps spewing certitudes, like myopic certitudes of what it thinks it wants. But we know that that's not how it goes. And the best thing about documentary practice is often the relationship between the particular and the specific, and the general and the abstract, right? That's like at the heart of a lot of documentary films. That's the strength. So of course, one has to really laser focus and hone in on the irreducibly specific character and the social context that you're sort of dealing with. How I sort of plan it is that I try and break my films into a first component, which is if I'm going to apply to grants. So, for instance, for docs that I'm producing right now, two docs are going via the grant route. So they're working on smaller sort of sizzle reels. One film that I'm producing that Arya, you also know closely of, is we're working on a longer this thing, because there the aim is to move towards, so it really depends, the aim is to move towards private equity. So it really depends on what path you want to take, and accordingly kind of make nuggets of the film. That's the production end of it. Having said that, it sounds like I've sort of figured it out all out. Maybe none of these films, who knows, right? Raise money. Nothing is sure. It's a constantly changing, very precarious market. I'm just telling you what my strategy is, might or might not work. In terms of the creatives, it's like a fever dream for the entirety of the time that you're shooting. And it's the main thing is that you arrive at a language, and you become the person who can make the film. And in a way, you have to kind of develop the stamina creatively, that it'll be a slow burn, slow drip process where the everyday cadences and rhythms of the space that you're shooting will reveal themselves slowly. It's almost like we all know that the first month of shooting is trash very often. Like, at least for me, it usually is, because characters are too sort of, tilted and conscious, and the selves that they're projecting in front of the camera is extremely curated and constricted. And it's only after, say, 2 weeks, something, that the first yawn comes, or the first sort of like casual, like some joke comes or something. And that's when you know that from this moment on, people are, because you're often looking for material that is soaked in everydayness and banality, and that's where a kind of, a texture of truth arrives. So then it's a sort of like a long haul of just keep going on, basically showing up constantly. Sorry, long answer.
I
But
also
I
just want
think,
to quickly add that because this is again focused on India and there are Indian filmmakers, is that it's also okay. Like I know this goes against the grain of everything that we often talk about, is to not have a super universal, super global story. It's if that is what you want to do, then by all means there is no demerit, because I think we've also kind of, we of course the context here is we are at an IDA panel and most people are trying to seek out, but often I think there is this question that comes up in the core application saying what is your target audience, and it's one of those we quickly fill just for the sake of filling. Most people do that. I think if at any point it feels like you are not making this super global universal film, then I think it's good to reconcile and then let that be what informs you as a filmmaker making that film, that it's not going to be super universal or globally far-reaching. Just a caveat.
I think that's very important. Like by the end of the day, it's important to also know the film you want to make, I feel. Um, okay, the third question is from Farid, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Both your films have traveled around the world. I'm curious to know, did you feel your films have audience priority?
The audience priority?
Yeah. Did you feel I have a feeling what they want to ask is maybe how have they received by the audiences, or they were more, I'm making an assumption here, but were they like more this critically acclaimed versus audience debate? Maybe
Right.
that's
So,
what I got.
right. So the thing is that this is always a kind of a really like a narrow tightrope that one walks when one is making a film that will go into festival. You know, the idea of the obscure, overly formal festival film, and whether it's a sort of opaque film that is not enjoyable for what is pejoratively called general audiences. Obviously, these are very tenuous terms. Um, the thing is that with me, like we were fortunate enough with this film that the film did get released theatrically in a few countries, and then found a popular home at HBO. So the film was widely seen, and the thing that the cliche that I think, the platitude that I think I've discovered, as have many other filmmakers, is that this whole bizarre notion of this is a festival film, festival audience, not very often film finds takers in a general sort of denomination that in an audience that you hoped existed, and lo and behold, it does. And there is a kind of a deep cynical rationality of the industry that crowbars in a feeling that there is no audience for this. But the truth is that for most half decent good films, there is a sizable chunk of audience that does actually stay there. Unfortunately, many of the films are not able to cross that bottleneck. But my main sort of understanding with this was that there is definitely an audience commercially as well.
That's really nice to hear, actually, because the industry would have you to believe the other way around. I think what you were saying. Cole, do you have
Yeah,
something to add to this?
I also believe there's an audience. I think there are a lot of things that are broken in terms of we all also understand that distribution is quite broken in many ways, especially within India and generally. So I feel like the audience is not always fully met, but I think we had the most amazing time when we screened the film in India, and I think that was incredible, for one, because you have these spaces that you're always in which are predominantly not what is called home, and when you kind of are able to engage with what emotions are evoked, then you're like, okay, so people really like watching films like this. It's not just they are engaging with it in a very emotional way, to the point that, I mean, Sarvnik's been, quite keen that a lot of our impact campaign is essentially about making sure that fishermen and the community that the film belongs to get to fully see it. Like that is, every time we're asked for impact strategy, that we can't think of anything beyond that, because that is the most logical and also it's the most honest one we can possibly have. And she's always been very clear that that is the impact strategy. And I feel like we made the kind of film that is not inaccessible, that is very kind of true to the world that the Kohlis in case of our film belong to. And so I feel like there's an audience within that. And of course, there's the larger audience. But honestly, like I think there's a whole different question about distribution and the mechanics of it and whether the subject affects your ability to release it somewhere or not. But I think generally one of the nicest things is when you the film across different geographical locations is you realize that people love watching documentaries, and there are enough people out there, and everybody from like a 12-year-old trying to sneak in to like really, really, really old people who come from a completely different race and language. And that's quite reassuring for the most.
Nice. So, moving on to our next question, which is from Pranav. I was wondering if there is a platform or a community garnered to nourish documentary filmmakers from South Asia.
Arya, I think you should answer that.
I mean, we do have a pitching platform. Dockage is there where I think all of us kind of have also met each other now. That where we go and we pitch, and even though it is a pitching platform, most often or not, you end up becoming friends there. And that in itself starts nourishing the creative processes outside of that space. But guys, apart from that, what are the other platforms?
Well, there's apart from Dockage, there's the new MIF platform. Then
MIF,
there's
yeah, which is this year is their first year. It's a
yeah,
co-production market, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, and there's
then,
Yeah.
also
then
Let's Talk and
there's
Let's
Let's
there's
Talk,
Talk is also there.
and there's
Hatha
the Good Pitch. I don't know if it's still continuing, but there was the Good
No,
Pitch.
no, no.
what's gone.
Then there are other Asian these things. Remember, there's
Dhaka Doc
Dhaka
Labs
Doc
is also
Lab.
there.
Ducks
Then
by the
there's
Sea.
And
yeah,
Docs
there's
by the Sea is
Docs by
incredible
the Sea. He's very
platform,
good.
actually.
What
It's
about
very,
the
very
Asian side
good.
of the dock? You know,
The what?
there's
Asian side of
the
the
Asian
doc.
side of the dock. That's also a pitching forum largely for Asian projects, though it's, I think, slightly more geared towards television. But it also, I mean, I pitched an earlier film, Cities of Sleep there. So I think there are these, but of course, people are right in assuming that these are far and few. The thing that all of us did was basically, if one had a specific doubt, one just reached out to the lot of, like filmmakers who've just gotten that grant or gone there earlier. That's the thing to do. And like all these people are often extremely friendly and helpful. So also, I have to say, I think at the Asian side of the dock, there is a list of resources also, or there used to be, I'm not sure anymore. But yeah, I think Dockage is also trying to put together a list.
I think, yeah. And I think more of a workshop would be than Let's Talk, because Dockage is the more of a pitching platform. But if you want this incubating, like a space where you can incubate your ideas and work on it further, then I think Let's Talk is more catering to that. Yeah, if we think of something, I'll just keep posting it in the chat. Yeah, and we'll move on to question from Aniket. Koval, where do we learn about production co-production guidelines for different countries?
There is a document. Let me see if I can. I mean, it's a good starting point, and then you have to kind of go through. There's the technical, and I highly recommend that you work with an accountant, a competent accountant who knows how to structure FEMA and FCRA, because or you could lose most of your income on taxes. Fun fact. I will neither confirm nor deny if that is something that has happened to somebody I know, but it happens often. You realize at some point that India is a fairly restrictive country, and so you have to funnel your kind of cash flow accordingly. So co-production is very tricky that way. I recently had a chat with the team at FFO, and they are actually quite keen. If somebody wants to go that route, it is more government support, but they are right now trying to work with filmmakers, especially I think after recent developments in the festival circuit. So I think their website has a lot of details and their kind of overview on how it works. But if you allow me a minute or so, I will post a small document that kind of details, which I usually share with people.
Yeah, like I think I just want to add to it what Koval said, that there is one thing about the treaties that we have with different countries. And then there are treaties with which it allows for us to use a certain fund, but then there are also tax treaties which are completely different. So just be aware of that. But moving on, a question from Zara. Shaunak, is there a way to watch your film Cities of Sleep somewhere?
I wish there
I
was a
also
more
have
cohesive
this
way of
question.
watching it, but sadly, it's not on a platform because the film preceded the rise of the platforms in India. But I see that somebody has put up a print on YouTube. I don't know who it is, but that's usually the best way. Otherwise, if you just write me, then I'll send it to you. Sadly, I don't have a better answer to give because the film was made on a films division grant. So it's a bit complicated and it's so long back before the streamers were there. So, but we're trying to put it on Mubi. Hopefully, it'll be on Mubi sooner than later. I mean, it's a conversation ongoing. So let's see.
Uh, so another question from Zara is, can you both share any thoughts about your relationships to subjects in your films?
Yeah, that's obviously a huge question. The thing is that it it's a really dense uppy downy relationship that keeps shape-shifting and changing through the course of the time. Like I shot my film for 3 years, and what happens is that initially, like I was saying, people are obviously very constricted and very conscious in front of the camera, and the camera is a very obtrusive kind of a presence. And over time, people relax, and a certain quality of boredom or everydayness or banality comes in, which is actually a good or a productive kind of quotidianness, a kind of boredom that you're looking for, because that's what you want. And then over time, like 3 years is a very long time to shoot somebody, and sometimes they are sick of you and sometimes you're sick of them, but it's like any dense friendship, right? And then comes the process of the edit where you're constantly kind of like talking to them, where you're walking this thin line of, you want to be, for instance, be very um sensitive to their questions of safety or their fears, which I had to be in my case. But at the same time, you also have to guard your autonomy as a filmmaker, or your editorial autonomy because in my case, I wasn't making a NGO-ish kind of a bleeding heart documentary on their bird hospital. So I had to guard or insist on my editorial autonomy on the film I wanted to make, while fully respecting their sense of, whenever it was a question about safety, I would fully respect. If it was a question about the relationship of the brothers, I would try and kind of wrench out some autonomy there. And of course, like I was mentioning earlier, once the film releases, then to make them equal stakeholders in the journey of the film, from festivals to theatrical releases to bigger awards and so on. And also money, it's like we sort of uh, made sure that, so it thankfully was the case that our producers funded the bird hospital for a full year, and I share whatever best director or award I get. I usually share a half of it with the brothers. So everybody and there's no one blueprint to it. You sort of like, which is not the case, that everybody has to sort of, each film makes its own kind of toolkit per se.
Koval?
Right. So I feel like this is usually a question that I like Sadnik to address, because the relationship between the director and the subject is deeply intimate. But I can speak to, for example, my relationship with Ganesh, where he has been one of my primary collaborators in production. It's simply a function of, I am not off the sea. I very quickly realized that I could assemble all the DOPs and the line production, and yet none of us really, despite a lot of the team being from Bombay, didn't really know what they were talking about or doing, because the minute you're in the deep sea, you're really in the deep sea. And so Ganesh became like a source of support, information, knowledge for every step of production planning the minute we leave the shore. And of course, like helping us navigate safety, navigate permissions and things like that. And that really does something also to the dynamic one shares within the means of production and being a participant in the film. And we have of course, I think a lot of us are doing this without thinking twice, which is that they're watching all the cuts. They're very much part of the process of the pitching, and they know the journey the film's taking while it's taking it. They get to see, they have first viewing rights over the rough cut. They're there at festivals. There is sharing of resource and credit. We're also very lucky to have a really kind of articulate and very sort of intelligent person. Both of them, Rakesh and Ganesh, they both shown up for our Q&As. And there are times that Ganesh, because he's a little more mobile, if you call him, he'll actually, if Sarnik's not there or I'm not there, Ganesh will go and do a Q&A, because so it's very interesting. We're also charting our own different negotiations with the way we look at our participants or our collaborators.
They kind of become your partners in the filmmaking
Oh, yeah,
process
absolutely.
at some point of time, because we make films for so many years that it's inevitable to happen, at least in a good collaboration, I would say. Okay, so we are out of time for one last question. Oh, I'm so sorry, guys. We have actually 6 more questions, but we are really, really out of time for it. So I just wanted to really, really thank both of you guys for being here. And Kisha is, I think, going to do the thank yous. But I also just before that wanted to thank Kisha, Maria, and Katie, and Armando, and Bob, and everyone who has helped us actually plan this panel. It has been amazing to speak with you guys, and it has been, and this is the first time I'm moderating, by the way. So without the help of both of you and the whole of our IDA team, I don't think it would have been possible. So I will hand it over to Kisha now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arya. Thank you, Koval and Shaunak. My goodness, that was such an engaging conversation. And thanks to everyone who tuned in for your questions and your presence. And so we're really excited to continue this conversation or this kind of theme on July 2nd with Pallavi Somusedi and on July 9th with Chennai Bulo. So we hope that you'll be able to join us again then. We'll be sending you out a post-event survey that we hope you can fill out. And outside of that, I just hope everyone has a beautiful day and we keep these conversations going. So thank you all. Thanks again, Shaunak and Koval and Arya. Have a great day. Have a great evening. Bye, everybody.
See you.
Bye.